Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Yashoda Nandana Braja Janarandana Yashoda Nandana Braja Janarandana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Yashoda Nandana Braja Janarandana Yashoda Nandana Braja Janarandana Yashoda Nandana Braja Janarandana Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jamuna Tira Vanachari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So today we'll take a look at Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 6, Chapter 15, Text 25. Ayam hi dehino deho dravyagana kriyātmaka dehino vividha klesha santapakrid Udahrita Ayang hidehi no deho Dravyajnana kriyātmaka Dehino vividha klesha Santapakridudahrita Ayang hidehi no deho Dravyajnana kriyātmaka Dehino vividha klesha Santapakridudahrita Ayam hidehino deho Dravyajnana kriyātmaka Dehino vividha klesha Santapakridudahrita. Others, please.
Ayam hi dehi no deho dravya jnana kriyatmakaha dehi no vivida klesha santapakrit udari taha.
Ayam hi dehi no deho
Ayam hi dehi no deho
dravya jnana kriyatmakaha dehi no vivida klesha santapakrit
Word to word. I am this. He, certainly. Dehina, of the living entity. Deha, body. Dravya jnana kriya atmaka, consisting of the material elements, the senses for acquiring knowledge, and the acting senses. Dena, of the living entity. Vividha, various. Klesha, sufferings. Santapa, and of pains. Krit, the cause. Udahrita, it is declared. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. The living entity in the bodily conception of life is absorbed in the body, which is a combination of the physical elements, the five senses for gathering knowledge, and the five senses of action, along with the mind. Through the mind, the living entity suffers three kinds of tribulations: adhibhautika, adhidaivika, and adhyātmika. Therefore, his body is the source of all miseries. Responsively, please. The living entity in the bodily conception of life. Oh, we don't have a screen, do we? Is absorbed in the body, which is a combination of the physical elements, the five senses for gathering knowledge, and the five senses of action, along with the mind. Through the mind, the living entity suffers three kinds of tribulations: adhibhautika, adhidaivika, and adhyātmika. Therefore, this body is a source of all miseries. Srila Prabhupada's purport. In the 5th canto, while instructing his sons, Rishabhadev said, Asannapi kleshada asadeha. The body, although temporary, is the cause of all the miseries in material existence. As already discussed in the previous verse, the entire material creation is based on mental concoction. The mind sometimes induces us to think that if we purchase an automobile, we can enjoy the material elements such as earth, water, air, and fire, combined in forms of iron, plastic, petrol, and so on. Working with the 5 material elements, panchabhutas, as well as with our 5 knowledge-gathering senses like the ears, eyes, tongue, and our 5 active senses like the hands and legs, we become involved in the material condition. Thus, we are subjected to the tribulations known as adhyātmika, adhidaivika, and adhibhautika. The mind is the center because the mind creates all these things. As soon as the material object is struck, however, the mind is affected and we suffer. For example, with the material elements, the working senses, and the knowledge-gathering senses, we create a very nice car. And when the car is accidentally smashed in a collision, the mind suffers. And through the mind, the living entity suffers. The fact is that the living entity, while concocting with the mind, creates the material condition. Because matter is destructible, through the material condition, the living entity suffers. Otherwise, the living entity is detached from all material conditions. When one comes to the Brahman platform, the platform of spiritual life, fully understanding that he is a spirit soul, aham brahmasmi, he's no longer affected by hankering, by lamentation or hankering. As the Lord says in the Bhagavad Gita, Brahmabhuta prasannatma nashochati nakangshati. One who is thus transcendentally situated at once realizes the Supreme Brahman and becomes fully joyful. He never laments nor desires to have anything. Elsewhere in the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says, Mamaivangsho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana mana sashtani indriyani prakritistani karshati. The living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they're struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. The living entity is actually part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and is unaffected by material conditions. But because the mind, mana, is affected, the senses are affected, and the living entity struggles for existence within this material world. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Mukhaṁ Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langayate Girim Jatkripatamahang Bande Shri Gurun Dinataranam Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupakadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Namah Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschati Deshatarine Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namaha Ayam hi dehino deha dravijnana kriyātmaka dehino vividha klesha santapakrid udahrita. The living entity in the bodily conception of life is absorbed in the body, which is a combination of the physical elements, the 5 senses for gathering knowledge, and the 5 senses of action, along with the mind. Through the mind, the living entity suffers 3 kinds of tribulations: adhibhautika, adhidaivika, and adhyātmika. Therefore, his body is a source of all miseries. So there are a number of things to consider in this verse. One is, as we saw in yesterday's verse, Srila Prabhupada highlights this in his purport to today's verse. That whatever it is we're attached to in this material world, it's all manobhava. All these things are creations of the mind. They exist. Bhava means existing, and they exist in our mind. And so there, the other day I mentioned different mystical traditions, the spiritual strands of different religions. They show up everywhere. There is a tendency in some folks to go beyond the rituals, to go beyond the recitation of the hymns. I remember, when I was a kid, I went to church. Turns out, by the time I turned 9, I was the only person in my immediate family who regularly went to church. When I was little, until the summer I turned 9, we lived in a town that our family had lived in for 5 generations, Lompoc, up on the Central Coast. My great-great-grandfather was one of the founders of the town. And so we were kind of a prominent family in a very small town. And even though my dad was agnostic, we went to church because people were watching, because that's what you do. However, when we moved to the LA area, it was real easy for Dad just to go scuba diving every Sunday. Why bother with church? You could take off at 5:30 in the morning and go hang out with his scuba diving buddies. He would often take me, but I frankly preferred church to getting seasick in a little boat sitting out in the middle of the water while everybody's having fun doing whatever they're doing down there. I dove, but not that much, and not as serious. I mean, I was like 7, 8 years old. But there's, there are all these things you do in church, and you've got the little program with a little schedule, which hymns we're going to sing, which prayers we're going to say the creed at this, at this part of the thing, and then there's going to be the sermon, and we're going to sing hymn number 432 or whatever it is, and you just kind of go through that, and it becomes quite rote, very kind of mechanical. This is just what we do. Just like earlier this morning, I was joking about. There are different stories about. Sometimes it's discussions of Harikatha. Maharaj suggested that he had heard the story in connection with the wedding, that some cat came, whatever the function was, some cat came and started yowling. And so the speaker or the officiating officer suggested that they get a bowl of milk for the cat, so the cat would be quiet and not disturb whatever, the class or the wedding or whatever it was. And of course, you give a cat a bowl of milk, cat's going to come back the next day, right? So the cat would come and get a bowl of milk, and then after, during the class or the whatever functions were going on, and after a while the cat died, after a long time, and somebody said, well, you got to get another cat. So we can, how do we have Harikatha? I mean, we've always done this. This is what we've always done. The cat comes, at the beginning of the talk. We bring out a bowl of milk, and therefore everything goes on auspiciously. It's like there's a short story written back in the late 40s by an American writer named Shirley Jackson called The Lottery. Not for the weak of heart. It was quite a shocking. It was published in the New Yorker magazine, and it was quite a shocking story when it was published, maybe 48 or 9, something like that. And the premise is that every June they would have this drawing, they'd have this lottery, and it was part of the cycle of auspiciousness. The slogan that went along with it was, lottery in June, crops be coming soon. So they're afraid if they didn't have this lottery, that they wouldn't have a good harvest this year. So as you get to the end of the story, as you read through the story, the ominous tone of the proceeding gradually builds until you get to the end of the story. And what the lottery is about choosing someone to sacrifice by stoning. And at the very end of in the last paragraph of the story, we start to get the sense that something's wrong when the person who ends up with the black spot, after several rounds of drawing, the one person who ends up with the black spot starts protesting, and then the kids, usually the boys, 8, 10, 11-year-old boys they're going to be the first ones, and it's just so. This is just something that we've always done, and that's what I think Jackson meant to point out. We go through these motions, thinking that that's going to ensure our well-being, without really critically considering what's really going on here. Is there really a causal relationship between picking one person in the town and stoning them to death every June and a good harvest? I mean, you could look at the drought years or the famine years or something like that, and you think, well, God, we had a lottery. It was the mayor that year, and we, and it rained just before the harvest, and all the grains were ruined, or whatever, or some blight came and wiped out the orchards. And so anyway, we go through it's. I don't remember how I got there now, but it's our attachment to these things. This is something that's created in the mind that if I do this, everything will be great. And now in this verse, we're being instructed that it's the bodily conception of life that really is the cause of our misery. And the verse says, vivita klesha, various kinds of misery, and Srila Prabhupada specifies it in his translation, as he often does. So these three kinds of miseries: adhibhautika, adhidaivika, and adhyātmika. Suffering that's caused by our body and mind, by our self, bhuta, the self. So these are my worries. These are the aches and pains that I have. And if you're, 25, 30 years old, and you're lamenting the aches and pains you feel now, buckle up. Gets better. I remember one Christmas, when we lived here in San Diego, at Christmas we would go up to Lompoc. My mom married someone who lived in Lompoc after she divorced my father, and actually an old friend of mine. Anyway, there's a story. But so we would go up over the river and through the woods, I guess, to grandmother's house to spend Christmas with my mom and her husband and my cousins and whatever aunts and uncles were left, at the time. And so the tradition was at Christmas Eve we'd get together, first at my grandpa's house, and then when he sold that house and my cousin Jim and his family moved in, and then at Jim's house. Aunt Betty's was right next door. She was my dad's big sister. And so it was a whole big family, extended family, big gathering. And there was, I remember one evening, maybe mid-90s, all the baby boomer cousins were sitting around in one room talking, and my cousin Mary said that she had read that maybe some kind of scientists were predicting that folks our age would live well into our 90s. And I was like probably 45. I think I was in my mid-40s at the time, and I groaned because I just thought, oh my God, what I'm going through now, I have to go through it for another 40, 50 years, and it's going to keep getting worse and worse and worse every year. Give me a lunch break. So these problems caused by the body and by the mind, we think our mind is constantly chattering at us. And this is a big part of the meditation culture that's grown in our country over the last 50, 60 years especially, where people realize that it's the mind that's causing so much of their suffering. And the Buddhists, everybody, like as I said, there's a mystical tradition in every religion that recognizes that the problem is our misidentification, that we identify with our body and all the stuff that we attach to it. And I say that deliberately, that we attach to it, because it's the mind that does it. If I'm living in a house and the house burns down, it's a huge tragedy. If I move out of the house and next week the house burns down, it's a drag for the folks who live there. But I'm cool. Yeah, exactly. Or Srila Prabhupada, at the end of the first paragraph, he uses the example of a car. He says, with the material elements, the working senses, the knowledge-gathering senses, we create a very nice car, and when the car is accidentally smashed in a collision, the mind suffers, and through the mind, the living entity suffers. And this was illustrated to me very clearly. I think it was 93. I had bought the only new car that I've ever owned in my life. We'd bought a new Saturn. Our old car was dying. It was costing us anywhere from $350 to $650 bucks a month to keep that car running. And we realized if we bought a new car, if someone gave us enough credit to buy a new car, we'd know how much it costs to keep that car going every month. And so we bought a new Saturn. And a few months after we bought that car, I had taken dropped Krishnamai off at Mission Bay High, and I was coming back down on Hornblende, as one does, to keep off of Grand Avenue during the rush. And, of course, Ingram is packed. And so I'm sitting there at the intersection, and the guy on the inside lane waves me through, because you can't see the other lane. Guy waves me through, and as I get to the outside lane, to the right-hand lane, going towards the bay on Ingram, south on Ingram, a plumbing truck hit my new car, my shiny new car. And I remember it very clearly, because I immediately thought, wait a minute, you're supposed to know better than this. Why? I got out and I looked at the fender, and the wheel was bent and everything, and I thought, why'd that guy hit me? The guy didn't hit me. I was fine. I was okay. But my mind made me suffer insanely, because this shiny new thing that I apparently had become a little attached to over the last few months, I only had it a few months. It wasn't so pretty anymore, and it didn't work at all. Of course, and then there were all the things that went with that. I had a 9 o'clock class, which I was going to miss. We didn't have cell phones, so I don't remember how I let the English department at Mesa College know that I wasn't going to be able to make it to teach that. And it was just my mind was just reeling, and it was a terrible, terrible day. So all these things, they're created by the mind, by our through the mind, are being attached to these things because of identifying with this body. And then we have the adhidaivika klesha, those things caused by the forces of nature, which, in the Vedic darshan, the Vedic perspective, are all personified. There's a person behind everything. So you go, you propitiate Indra, the god of the rain, so that you have nice crops. Although Krishna did his whole kind of little lottery thing on that too, you guys just go, what is this, What is you doing? Is just something you go through the motions every year just for the, just because it's a habit, or is there a real reason for that? And Nanda Maharaj tried to explain to him, and he says, Indra Shmindra, Govardhan gives us everything. The streams, the grasses, everything. The cows go graze there. We should be worshiping, forget Indra, we should be worshiping Govardhan. And because he was so cute and his arguments were so clever, even argued from a completely materialistic, mechanistic point of view, actually. And they said, yeah, let's try it and see what happens. Well, we know what happened. Indra got a little hacked off and made a mess. So we have these adhidaivika. We're thinking, oh, it's summer, it's June, in San Diego, it should be sunny. Of course, if you've lived in San Diego, you know it's not going to be sunny in June. May not be sunny in July. And may not have been sunny in May. We got, June gloom, we got May gray. I don't know what we call it when it persists through July and into August, as it has sometimes. But, it's just like you get up in the morning and you're thinking, oh, it should be nice out, but it's like not even 60 degrees yet or something. Even where I live, we have to suffer these miseries. We have hurricanes, and sometimes it gets a little toasty, like 87, 88, or really cold, 66, 67 degrees. Everybody's got, you go to Mangalarti at the temple, and people will have their hats on, a sweater on, and socks on if it's below 70 degrees. Why? Because it's all a mental concoction. It's all conditioning. I remember I had a Zoom meeting with some devotees last month, must have been last month, because I was on Maui at Balabhadra and Gauramani's on Maui. And I had this Zoom meeting, and Mahavishnu Priya, who runs this office of the Ministry of Justice that I do some service for, she asked me how the weather was, and I pulled my phone over and opened up the weather app, and I said, it says 77, partly cloudy, slight trade winds. Perfect. But still, devotees used to say, oh gosh, so you're so unfortunate living here in Hawaii because you have to suffer to become Krishna conscious. And there's no suffering here. And I thought, well, I got two questions for you. One was, first is, you got to give me chapter and verse on, you got to suffer to become Krishna conscious. I mean, that's what we thought when we were brahmacharis, right? I'm going to get to that in a minute, if I have a minute. I may not. And the other thing is, what, no suffering? There's no suffering here? I've lived here a while, and I cannot remember a day when I didn't suffer physically, mentally, emotionally. And you'd think such a day would be so remarkable that you would remember it, but I can't think of one. This is the one place I'd had bronchitis, the one place I'd had staph infections, because everybody likes to live in Hawaii, right? It's nice and warm and moist, so bacteria say, all right, move me in. Let's have a big family here. And we do have hurricanes. We have traffic. We have parking problems. Well, yeah, I think I lived 3 times on the Big Island. In the last few years, we lived on the slope of an active volcano, which had a vent erupt just a few miles from our home back in 2018. Quite interesting to watch this lava flowing through subdivisions, over roads. It buried one of the favorite gathering places of local people, the Ahanui hot ponds. It's this place where you go hang out, and because of the thermal vents underneath, the water is like 103 degrees in this pond, 103 degrees salt water. Very chill, very relaxing. And devotees used to have gatherings there. And a favorite surfing and fishing spot, Isaac Hale Park, got a Hawaiian name, and all of a sudden it just ran away from me. But there's all kinds of misery there. I mean, these people lost their homes. And this was probably, it might have been like on the Big Island, it's the insurance companies divided into volcano zones, lava flow zones. Our home was in Zone 3. You could actually get insurance there. I think a lot of these homes were in Zone 2, very expensive insurance. In Zone 1, no insurance available. So these folks lost their homes and everything, just like we lose our homes to fires here in California. So many ways to suffer in this material world. So many ways. And there's a whole story about that too. So what I was thinking was, if the body is the source of our miseries, why pay any attention to the body? Why, right? Why not become completely aloof? The only way to become aloof is to become detached enough that we can see there's a difference. Srila Prabhupada draws a very stark difference here between the material conception of life and the spiritual conception of life. He ends with a couple of Bhagavad Gita verses that remind us that the body consists of one of Krishna's energies. This is Krishna's energy. And Krishna tells us in the 6th chapter of the Gita that, if we want to be a successful yogi, we can't eat too much, eat too little, sleep too much, sleep too little. And he tells us that we need to be regulated in our habits of eating, sleeping, working, and recreation. It's right there. Vihara, kicking back. So regulated or temperate recreation is also part of that. So we need to make sure that we get enough sleep. We need to be sure that we eat enough, not too much, and the right kinds of foods. And with the understanding that although it's made of material elements and is capable of causing all kinds of suffering, especially as we've surrendered ourselves to the Lord as devotees, we need to take care of this, just like the car, right? You got to take the car every 3 or 5 months, depending on how much you pay for your oil, I guess, to get the oil changed and the fluids checked and all that kind of thing. You got to check your tires and check your radiator fluid every Saturday. Check your oil every Saturday morning. You have to, you make a schedule, so you do this stuff. So the car keeps running so it can do what you need to do. Same thing with our body. It's referred to as a yantra, as a machine, a vehicle, and we need to take care of that. And there's a really good example of the Lord's personally instructing something along these lines in Antya-lila of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. And we know the story. Sanatana Goswami has gone from Vrindavan to Puri to spend some time with Lord Chaitanya, and he's contracted some disease from drinking bad water along the way. And his body is covered with all these oozing sores. And there's no way he's going into town. There's no way he's going to the temple. And there is no way he's going anywhere near Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, because he knows Mahaprabhu's nature. He's so affectionate that whenever he sees Sanatan, starting with the very first time they met, he just threw those long arms around him and drew him into his breast in a real tight embrace. And he thought, my body's just gross and disgusting. Maybe I should throw it away at the Rath Yatra. And so he has this plan. And he's consulted with Jagadananda Pandit. Jagadananda Pandit says, well, just get out of here, go back to Vrindavan. It'll eventually heal. In the meantime, you won't bother the Lord with it. Now, Mahaprabhu upbraided him for listening to Jagadananda Pandit. He says, you're an experienced man. I depend on you for advice, and you're asking that kid for advice? Forget it. And then he says, what you're thinking of, don't even think about it. And so here's what he tells him. Prabhu kohe, Vaishnav deka prakriti kabunoi, aprakrita deha bhaktir chidanandamoy. Very interesting language. Mahaprabhu said, the body of a devotee is never material. It is to be considered transcendental, full of spiritual bliss. Chidanandamoy. The devotee's body is composed entirely of bliss and awareness, spiritual awareness. And then he says, Diksha kale bhakta kore atma samarpana se kale Krishna tare Krishna atmasam. At the time of initiation, when a devotee fully surrenders himself to the service of the Lord, or we could also read it to the extent the devotee surrenders himself, as we surrender ourselves, because surrender is an ongoing activity. Krishna accepts him to be as good as himself, atmasam. That his body is, he considers that the devotee's body is the same as his own. And then he cites a verse from the 11th canto, and then he says, Krishna somehow or other manifested these itching sores on the body of Sanatana Goswami and sent him here to test me. If I had hated Sanatana Goswami and had not embraced him, I certainly would have been chastised for offenses to Krishna. And he'd explained to Sanatana before that, look, we have different kinds of relationships with different people. Some relationships are particularly affectionate. When I see you, I just can't help myself because you're such a great devotee. So then he tells Sanatana, you've surrendered that body to me, so it's not yours to do with as you like. I have some things I intend to accomplish with that body. And boy, howdy did he ever, right? So many things. Brihad Bhagavatamrita, Hari Bhakti Vilas, and we know Sanatana Goswami was like the uncle, the grandfather to all the Brijbasis while he was living in Vrindavan. He did so much service, establishing temples and so many things. So he told him, don't you even think about him. And then he embraced him, and all the sores cleared up. So that when we think, when we think of the body as a source of all our miseries, or the source of all our miseries, as we might say sometimes, it's the attachment that makes that the case. When the Buddhists talk about suffering, and then when they talk about cessation of suffering, which is their goal, that's as far as they go. And how do they get there? By learning some sense of detachment through their meditation and whatever other practices, their discourses, and that kind of thing. But that's all they get to. They get to kind of a point of zero. Because the bodily pains are still there, but because they've become detached from them, they're not suffering so much from them. They don't create suffering. So I suffer when I'm cruising a parking lot for 5, 6, 7 minutes looking for a space, and then all of a sudden you see somebody tap on their brake lights and you think, okay, wait for the backup lights to come on before you turn. And you turn your blinker on to kind of let everybody know. And then you see somebody backing out, and someone whips around and snakes the spot on you. Oh, it's so painful. You want to get out and really, let that person have it. Really tell them how unfortunate the whole cosmos is because their mother and father met or something like that. I mean, we suffer so much when that happens. What happened? I missed a parking spot. I've been missing parking spots for 8 minutes, for goodness sake. There's going to be, go up to the next level or whatever. It's not the end of the world. Or the old lady who is counting out her purchase, going to pay for her purchase out of her little plastic coin purse, and she's counting out the quarters and then the nickels and then the pennies, and and the line is building up. That's usually when I turn around to the people behind me and apologize, because I say, yeah, whenever I get in line, that's what happens. So it's obviously me. Otherwise, we're all just going crazy. And this old lady probably is younger than I am now, but. It's the mind that creates the suffering, and it's because it's the mind that yokes us to this world. We use our mind to let ourselves become attached. So this is my country. If somebody does something to my country, just like back after 9/11, all of a sudden, everybody looked very patriotic. We were having all these patriotic rallies. People were flying like 6 or 8 foot, 6 or 8 foot American flags from the post holes in their pickup trucks. And I mean, you know, just God bless America all of a sudden because somebody attacked us. But if somebody attacks Ukraine, it's a long ways away. I have a hard time getting really exercised about it. And the media have to work really hard to kind of like keep our attention focused on that. Because something else is going to happen tomorrow, right? And we're going to get worried about that. We're worried about, you know, it's a year and a half away and we're already worried about the next election. And, you know, we're all, you know, it's the mind that creates these things. So that's what Krishna tells us to work with in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. He tells us that's the focus of yoga. Patanjali tells us in the second of his Yoga Sutras, Chitta Vritti Nirodha. That yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga means stilling all these agitations in the mind. And then the 3rd sutra, he says, being thus situated, the seer is able to live as its own self. In other words, we're able to behave as consciousness. But it just requires some detachment. And that's what that's what all that meditation is supposed to be about. That's what yoga is really meant for. If you look at the Yoga Sutras, I don't know if anybody here I've done this here before. If you look at the Yoga Sutras, can anybody guess what percentage of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras address asana? 5? Do I have any other offers? 8%. Do I have a 12? Do I have a 12%? Anybody? 12%? 1%. You, my friend, are the winner. Out of 1,200 words, about 11 or 12 words address asana. And why? Because you got to be a little fit to be able to sit and meditate for hours a day. That's all. All the rest of it addresses so many other things having to do with controlling the mind, which although Arjuna objects is impossible, Krishna counters with, yeah, it's hard, but it is possible with detachment and practice. And because of the time, I'm going to skip my practice story. I shared that with the folks on Friday night. So you can ask Naimisha if she remembers my Pablo Casal's example. I'll stop here for any discussion or objections, questions, whatever. He's waiting. Prabhu, I have a question. Maharaj, I have a question, please. Vijay Krishna Prabhu, are you there?
Yes, Maharaj, I'm here.
Everyone's waiting for your question or comment.
May I?
Please.
Thank you, Maharaj. You're most kind. Dandavat pranams. Maharaj, there's a quote in the purport which goes as follows. Quote, when one comes to the Brahman platform, the platform of spiritual life, fully understanding that he is a spiritual soul, aham brahmasmi, he is no longer affected by lamentation or hankering, end quote. So I am confused because you know better than me that as Rupa Nugas that we are, we try our best to follow the instructions of Rupa Goswami in his Upadeshamrita, Nectar of Instruction. And in verse 3, what Rupa Goswami says is that we should be enthusiastic, we should struggle with confidence, we should be patient, and we should be patient. So it seems to me that to be enthusiastic, to struggle with confidence, and to be patient is the same as, in some way, hankering for something. So based on all of this, my exact question is, what is the difference between this hankering being mentioned in the purport for today's verse and the hankering being mentioned by Rupa Goswami in his Upadeshamrita?
Thank you.
And if I may, the hankering is related to if we are enthusiastic, if we struggle with confidence, and if we are patient, we will achieve full success in the execution of pure devotional service. So is it that we are, in other words, is it that we are allowed as practitioners of the Bhakti process to hanker for something in some way?
Well, yeah,
that is my question.
Yeah, there will. Yeah, well, again, there's this stark contrast between material hankering and spiritual hankering. So utsaha nischaya dhairyat, and whenever I talk about that third verse, I focus on those three: enthusiasm, persistence, steadiness, or as you put it, struggling with confidence. And confidence, that's a whole. Well, maybe I can give that a nod, because I saw a post yesterday, I think, on Facebook, where some devotee posted the words, "hope beyond hope," and someone asked what that meant, and I thought, well, I know what he's talking about. Prabhupada also called it hope against hope. And this is something mentioned in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Ashabandhu. Ashabandha. So this hoping against hope, this confident that I will become Krishna conscious. Just like I saw one devotee that I met in Denver post something on Facebook. I posted something on Facebook. It's a picture of Krishna with the cowherd boys and some quotations. And she posted something like, "I will go back to Godhead in this life." And I said, "Okay, will you take the rest of us with you?" But I admired that determination. I'm going to do this. I've got this, because we have a whole support network. So the hankering. It's the hankering that we have in this material world due to our attachment that creates the lamentation, because things don't always work out. Maybe things don't usually. Maybe things sometimes work. Maybe things occasionally work out, but we think that because we've projected in our mind that I am when I grow up, I am going to be the president of the United States, and we end up working in an Amazon warehouse or something. That's a kind of suffering. Other people, if they had that job in the Amazon warehouse compared to the working conditions where they are, maybe in a mine or something like that, maybe they're children who work in a mine so that we can have our iPhone 14 Super X, Super Triple X model or whatever they are. Relatively, that's a fairly cushy job. I mean, at least you occasionally are allowed to go to the bathroom and you're indoors or something like that. So these are all creations of the mind. So that hoping against hope, that I will become Krishna conscious if only I try. Here comes my Pablo Casal's story. I seem unable to avoid it again. There's an anecdote told about Maestro Pablo Casals for those who aren't really old. He was the best. He was the most highly regarded cellist throughout most of the 20th century. I think probably succeeded by Yo-Yo Ma. And but before Yo-Yo Ma, there was Pablo Casals, and there's a story that a young reporter was interviewing Maestro Casals, And in the interview, he mentioned that every day he spends several hours, I don't remember if it was 3 or 4 hours, or maybe even as much as 6 hours a day, practicing. And he said, by practicing, I don't mean playing pieces. I mean exercises and running scales. And now, Maestro was in his 90s at this point, and his performing career was way in the rearview mirror. So the reporter was kind of confused. So she asked him, Maestro, why is it that you practice so much every day? I mean, you're universally regarded as the greatest cellist in the world. Everyone admires your skills, your art. Why is it that you practice so much every day now, at this part, in this time of your life? And Maestro shrugged and said, I think I'm making progress. So I like this. I always like to couple. I always like to make sure that we've got the dhairya, the patience there, so that we don't think. We don't have to be bewildered by what Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur calls utsahamai, the first obstacle that we have to deal with in the stage of anartha nivritti. In other words, a kind of like unwarranted sense of accomplishment, like I've gotten somewhere. I've been chanting 16 rounds for 4.5 weeks, and I really dug that kirtan, and so I must be a pure devotee by now, thinking we've gone somewhere we haven't. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that's one of the obstacles that we need to, the first of the obstacles that we need to overcome. We used to call it pure devotee syndrome or something like that. There's one devotee in Honolulu designated by our temple president at one point the biggest troublemaker. So because he was the most whatevers got to go with him to some festival that we had on the Big Island, but this is back in '71. And this devotee said, I tried to straighten him out on something. I was trying to be gentle, and he just looked at me and he said, please, Prabhu, please don't commit offense against me. And I just went, what? I had a hard time processing that. He broke me right then. I just thought, what? Please, Prabhu, please, dear Master, please don't commit offense against me. And I just said, so that's kind of the picture of us when we're dealing with that. So we have to be patient. We have to constantly strive and be patient with the confidence, so I got all three of them in there, that we're making progress and we will ultimately succeed. That's a point that I made the other night. Bhakti is very user-friendly because although we may have to do karma perfectly to get the results, and then they're temporary. And we may have to do yoga perfectly to get the results. May not last. Same thing with jnana. With bhakti, we can mess up. We can continue to mess up, and we don't lose anything. We don't have to go. We don't have to go back to start. What's the card you get in Monopoly? Return to start. Don't pass go. Don't collect $200. We don't have to go back to start again. We pick up nehabi kramanasasti. We pick up where we left off and continue to make progress. Now, it seems like there's a little time getting traction at the beginning, but we see some people it clicks very quickly. And we understand, oh, this is not her first kirtan. It's not his first kirtan. I really appreciate how you brought those three elements in: utsahat, nischayat, and dhairyat. Enthusiasm. Just like Dharma was telling me, well, if you're cool as a cucumber when you give a class, your class will be just about that colorful, just about that interesting. We have to be enthusiastic. We have to really want it. As Rupanugas, we may aspire for Raganuga Bhakti, or if we take Jiva Goswami's concession in his Sandarbhas, we may understand that we're engaged in Ajataruchi Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti. We're engaging in Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti because our goal is Vrindavan, Our goal is that kind of love for Krishna. But we don't have that taste yet. So Jiva Goswami says that you can consider that Raganuga Bhakti, even though the emphasis is on the vidhi, on the rules. It's not not really purely Vaidhi Bhakti, because there's a distinction between the two based on the impetus, based on the motivation and the goal. So that way we can be enthusiastic. I'm on the path. I'm in the right company. I'm moving along. It may be a little slow sometimes. When we're climbing a mountain, we go, sometimes, we go up in the foothills and then we have to go down in a valley. And we shouldn't be discouraged by that, because we go up again and then maybe there's another valley and maybe we have to cross a chasm or something like that. But that doesn't, if you look at the trend line, we're headed toward the peak. We're headed toward the summit. So we shouldn't be discouraged. We should always be introspective, always see how we're making progress. Anybody know, well, we all know Nimai Hemphill. He has a question that he asks devotees who've been practicing for a long time, consistently. He asked me when I was here in the winter, and he asked me again the other night, are you more loving? Have you become more loving by this practice? And I actually had to think a little bit. I actually took it seriously when he asked me, and I had to think. And yeah, actually, I'm a better person than I was 53, 54 years ago. I was a mess, 21 years old, and had all these problems going on. But I'm much better equipped to deal with those kinds of things now because of my practice and because of the good company I've had over all those years, including I have to say it, including the good influence of my family, my former wife and my daughters, intelligent, good-hearted all women, kind of like helped turn me into a human being. So that's what we look for. Bhakti Pareshana. Maybe I'd better not. Maybe I'd better not. But there is a gauge, and we discussed this the other night. So you can ask Naimisha about that. Thank you for your question, Vijay Krishna. Excellent question,
Maharaj,
as to be expected.
Again, to hear from you is the best type ever of good fortune. Thank you very much. Wonderful answer to my question.
Thank you. Grantha Raja Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Gauda Bhakta Vrinda ki jai.